Tarantino loves the 90s, but the 80s? He's got way less love for that decade. Straight up called it the worst time for movies. Too clean, too safe, too focused on making characters likable instead of interesting. We were after a real chancy cinema with balls. And this was a ball-less decade. But every once in a while, a movie would pierce through, Tarantino said. Only 6, according to him, but they're the best of the best from an era he otherwise couldn't stand. Jim McBride's Breathless makes the list, and Tarantino calls it one of the coolest movies ever. Richard Gere in full 80s sex symbol mode, a movie packed with comic book and rockabilly energy. Basically everything Tarantino was obsessed with. This was Michael Mann's project at first, but he bailed to make The Keep, and McBride took over. Back in '83, critics tore this thing apart. Nobody wanted a remake of Jean-Luc Godard's classic. It grossed $20 million off a $7 million budget, so not a total disaster. And now it probably looks a lot better stacked up against half the garbage that tops the box office today. Tarantino doesn't just like Breathless. He says it's one of the only movies from that decade that actually felt like the kind of movie he would have made. His words, the closest thing to a Tarantino movie that existed before he started making movies. Hal Ashby had a killer run in the 70s. Then the 80s happened, and everything went sideways. Drugs, studio interference, total chaos behind the scenes. 8 Million Ways to Die had Jeff Bridges, a pre-Untouchables Andy Garcia, and a script by Oliver Stone. On paper, it was stacked. In execution, a total mess. Ashby was fired right after filming Wrapped, and the studio hacked it apart in post. Alexandra Paul said years later that this film taught her something very important. You can have great talent on a movie, but if you don't have a good script, you got nothing. People still argue about this one. Some call it a disaster, some call it a lost gem. Tarantino's on the lost gem side. Says it's right there with other gritty crime films of the era, even if it's nowhere near as polished. Tarantino's been a Paul Verhoeven guy for a long time. He's even defended Showgirls, saying it's just misunderstood. Flesh and Blood makes the cut, and if you've seen it, you get why. Rutger Hauer leading a bunch of mercenaries in a filthy, brutal, no-romance version of the Middle Ages. Jennifer Jason Leigh, years before she worked with Tarantino, plays the kidnapped noblewoman who gets tangled up with Hauer's crew. Verhoeven made this to counter all the Hollywood movies that made medieval Europe look like some fairy tale. He wanted the filth, the disease, the sheer awfulness of it. And he got it. The shoot was brutal too. Verhoeven and Hauer had worked together 5 times before this, but the tension on set was so bad they never worked together again. Verhoeven even called it the worst experience of his life, so bad he almost quit filmmaking. For the US release, they had to heavily cut down the nudity and sexual violence. Michael Mann's Manhunter brings Red Dragon to the screen years before Silence of the Lambs. And yeah, it got overshadowed, but some people, including Tarantino, think it's the superior version. Brian Cox plays Hannibal Lecter, and he and Anthony Hopkins reportedly made a pact never to compare performances. And to this day, they've kept that rule. Before Mann got the job, David Lynch was actually in talks to direct. He lasted a while but bailed, not over creative differences, just couldn't stomach the subject matter. Called it completely degenerate, said he didn't want it in his country club. Mann took over. Brian Cox stepped in as Lecter, and the movie came and went at the box office. Silence of the Lambs took all the glory, but Manhunter is still one of Tarantino's favorite 80s films. A lot of people barely even know this movie exists. Bad timing killed it at the box office. It was the last movie De Laurentiis Entertainment Group put out before the studio went under, so it got no marketing, no push. But it survived. Now it's a horror western cult classic. Kathryn Bigelow's first solo film, and it almost didn't happen. The studio told her if she didn't prove herself in 5 days, she was gone. She kept the job. Bill Paxton, Lance Henriksen, Jeanette Goldstein, Aliens fans will notice the cast right away. James Cameron had just worked with them, told Bigelow they were perfect for it. And they were. The whole thing started as a western, but nobody cared about westerns in the 80s. Horror was hot, so they blended the two. That mix is what makes it work. Tarantino's obsessed with it. He said he's been a fan for decades. The massacre scene is one of his all-time favorites. Said he saw the movie 5 times just for that scene alone. Say Cimino, and people think The Deer Hunter or Heaven's Gate. But 5 years after Heaven's Gate tanked his career, Cimino made what Tarantino calls one of the best movies of the 80s. Mickey Rourke plays Stanley White, a Vietnam vet turned NYPD cop with a one-track mind: clean up Chinatown's gang wars. His main target is John Lone's character, a rising power in the Chinese underworld, running drugs out of a restaurant and taking down the old guard. Everything builds to a ridiculous final shootout, one of Tarantino's favorite killer movie moments. Said it's so intense you forget to breathe. The role was originally for Clint Eastwood or Paul Newman, but they passed. Rourke took it, and Cimino turned in a movie way ahead of its time. He once said the 21st century was going to belong to China. People thought he was crazy. Decades later, looks like he knew exactly what he was talking about.